Genesis 6 has 4 verses that have generated more theological debate than entire chapters of the Bible. 4 verses that most people skip because they don't understand what they're reading. 4 verses that speak of beings that shouldn't exist, of a boundary that should never have been crossed, and of a question that 2,000 years of theologians have not been able to answer definitively. What exactly were the Nephilim? Today we're going to walk through everything the Bible says about them. What the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest texts in Judaism, adds with a level of detail that is genuinely disturbing. What the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in 1947 reveal about their fate. And the question that none of the 3 main interpretations has been able to resolve satisfactorily: if the flood wiped them all out, why does the Bible mention them again centuries later? Before we go further, leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think the Nephilim were supernatural beings, or is there a more natural explanation behind the text? And if this kind of analysis gives you something, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The text that starts everything is Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It is brief to the point of frustration. It says that when human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives any they chose, and that from that union the Nephilim were born, the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 verses, no explanation of who the sons of God actually are, no physical description of the Nephilim, no resolution about their fate at that point. Only the statement that they existed, that they were powerful, and that they appeared before the flood. And then the text moves directly to the corruption of humanity and God's plan to send the flood. As if those 4 verses were a footnote, the author of Genesis chose not to develop further. But that silence has consequences. What the Bible doesn't say about the Nephilim has filled thousands of pages of commentaries, theological treatises, and rabbinic debates over 25 centuries. And all of that material begins with a single question: who are the sons of God? There are 3 main interpretations, and none of them closes every problem the text raises. The first and oldest is also the most dramatic. The sons of God were angels, celestial beings who descended to earth, united with human women, and fathered a hybrid race. This is the interpretation the Book of Enoch defends, and it was the dominant view among the early church fathers during the first centuries of Christianity. The strongest argument in its favor comes from the Hebrew text itself. The expression Bene ha-Elohim, sons of God, appears elsewhere in the Old Testament, specifically in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38:7. And in every one of those contexts, it clearly refers to heavenly beings, not to men. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used in the time of Jesus, translates that expression directly as angels in the Genesis 6 passage. The New Testament also points in that direction. 2 Peter 2:4 states that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into chains of darkness, reserving them for judgment. And Jude 1:6 speaks of angels who did not keep their own position of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, whom God has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Ancient Jewish and Christian tradition always connected these passages to the event in Genesis 6. The second interpretation gained ground with Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century and became the dominant view in medieval Western theology. According to this reading, the sons of God were men from the godly line of Seth, the son Adam and Eve had after Abel's death. The daughters of men would be women from the corrupt line of Cain. Marriages between those 2 lines would have produced a spiritually corrupted offspring that accelerated the moral collapse that justified the flood. The central argument of this interpretation is theological. Angels are spiritual beings without a physical body. And Jesus himself said in Matthew 22:30 that in the resurrection, people will be like the angels in heaven, who neither marry nor are given in marriage. If angels don't marry, they can't father physical children. And if they can't father physical children, the sons of God in Genesis 6 cannot be angels. The third interpretation holds that the sons of God were kings or powerful rulers, tyrants from Cain's line who took as many women as they wanted in a brutal exercise of power. The Nephilim would then be their offspring, men of fame and violence who filled the earth with injustice. It is the least dramatic of the three interpretations, but it has the merit of requiring no supernatural element to work within the text. None of the three closes every problem the passage raises, but it is the first one that generates the most extensive and most disturbing material outside the biblical canon, and that material is the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is an apocryphal text attributed to Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, the man of whom Genesis 5:24 says simply that he walked with God and then was no more, because God took him. The book was written between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947. It is the only apocryphal book cited directly in the canonical New Testament in Jude 14 and 15, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church considers it canonical to this day. What the Book of Enoch does with those 4 verses of Genesis 6 is expand them into a complete narrative that changes the scale of the event radically. According to the Book of Enoch, the sons of God were the Watchers, a specific group of angels assigned to observe and guide humanity. 200 of them, led by an angel named Semyaza, descended to Mount Hermon on the northern border of Canaan. Before descending, they made a pact among themselves. They bound each other by oath not to turn back, because they knew that what they were about to do was a transgression with no return. They took human wives, and from that union the Nephilim were born. But the Book of Enoch doesn't stop there. What it describes next is a chain of corruptions that the Watchers introduced into humanity alongside their children. Azazel, one of the leaders of the Watchers, taught men how to forge swords, shields, and breastplates. He taught women the art of adornment and seduction. Other Watchers taught enchantments, astrology, the cutting of roots, and the knowledge of plants for dark purposes. What the Book of Enoch describes is not just a sexual transgression, it is the introduction of forbidden knowledge into humanity, military technology, magic, manipulation, all at once, all from the outside. If you're enjoying this analysis and want us to keep bringing this kind of content, like the video and subscribe now if you haven't yet. Tell us in the comments which theory you find most convincing: fallen angels, the line of Seth, or tyrannical kings. The Nephilim born from that union had a problem the Book of Enoch describes with philosophically unsettling precision. They were half angel and half human. When they died, their physical body died like any human body, but their spiritual component, what they had inherited from their angelic fathers, had no assigned destination. They couldn't go to the place reserved for humans because they weren't fully human. They couldn't return to the place of angels because their fathers had been expelled from it. They were trapped in an intermediate state, wandering the earth as spirits without a home. The Book of Enoch calls them the spirits of the giants. It says they afflict, oppress, invade, battle, and destroy upon the earth. That even without a physical body, they experience hunger and thirst and cause suffering to human beings. This description is what later Jewish and Christian tradition identified as demons, not fallen angels themselves, but the bodiless offspring of the Watchers, condemned to roam the earth causing harm without being able to find rest. Meanwhile, the Watchers who fathered them received their own judgment. The archangel Michael was sent to bind Semyaza and his companions in the valleys of the earth, until the day of final judgment. Azazel was bound hand and foot and thrown into a desert called Dudael, covered in darkness, where he will remain until the day of judgment. This description of Azazel connects directly to the scapegoat ritual in Leviticus 16, where one of 2 goats is sent into the wilderness for Azazel. Most modern readers don't recognize that name, but in ancient Jewish tradition that name carried a specific weight and a concrete reference. Now we come to the question that no interpretation has resolved completely. Genesis 6:4 says something that is almost always read quickly and forgotten. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Those 2 words, and also afterward, are an enormous problem for any interpretation that claims the flood eliminated them all. Because the flood came precisely after that passage, and if the flood destroyed all life on earth except for Noah and his family, how is it possible that the Nephilim appear again in Numbers 13:33, centuries later? The spies sent by Moses into Canaan returned terrified. They say they saw there the descendants of Enoch from the Nephilim, and that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. That fear produces 40 years of wandering in the desert. The shadow of the Nephilim reaches into Israel's story in a way that almost no one connects back to Genesis 6. The proposed solutions have been several. Ancient rabbinic tradition held that some survived the flood in a way the text doesn't explain. Other commentators proposed that the transgression of the angels was repeated after the flood, producing a second generation of giants. The Book of Giants, one of the texts found at Qumran, describes the destruction of the Nephilim before the flood. But it doesn't resolve the question of the post-flood giants. What we can trace with certainty is that the giants of Canaan appear multiple times after the flood in the canonical text. Og, king of Bashan, is described in Deuteronomy 3:11 as the last survivor of the Rephaim, with an iron bed 9 cubits long. Goliath, the Philistine David defeated, measured according to the Masoretic text 6 cubits and a span, approximately 3 meters tall. His 4 brothers are also mentioned as warriors of exceptional stature in 2 Samuel 21. Whether the Nephilim of Genesis 6 and the giants of Canaan are the same lineage or 2 related but distinct phenomena is something the biblical text does not resolve. And that ambiguity, far from being a flaw in the account, appears to be part of its construction. Genesis introduces the Nephilim with a brevity that raises more questions than it answers. What is clear is the effect of their presence on humanity. Immediately after Genesis 6:1-4, verse 5 says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And verse 6 says it grieved him to his heart that he had made man. The structure places the Nephilim passage immediately before that description of total evil. The proximity is a way of arguing without making the argument explicit. What the Nephilim represent in the biblical narrative is not just a strange episode in the days of Noah. They represent a boundary that was crossed, a mixture that should not have happened, and consequences that extend far beyond the moment when it occurred. The flood did not erase everything. The text itself says so. And that continuity, that impossibility of fully resolving what was set in motion in Genesis 6, is what makes the Nephilim one of the most persistent mysteries in all of Scripture. If this video opened questions you didn't have before, that is exactly what we're here for. Leave us a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell us in the comments which part hit you hardest. The description in the Book of Enoch, the problem of the Nephilim after the flood, or the connection to the giants of Canaan. Every comment helps the next video reach more people. See you in the next one.